6 months after the Toronto Protocols were signed, the world had adapted to the reality of a fourth major economic bloc with remarkable speed. The Commonwealth Economic Zone was processing over $200 billion in monthly transactions, had established development banks in 5 countries, and was funding infrastructure projects from Jamaica to Bangladesh. More importantly, it had demonstrated something that many economists had thought impossible: genuinely equitable international partnership. Sunak stood on the observation deck of the London Eye, looking out over the Thames as the sun set behind the city's skyline. Tomorrow marked the first anniversary of that dinner in Ottawa where everything had changed, and he was reflecting on how completely the global landscape had shifted. His phone buzzed with a message from Trudeau. Remarkable how much can change in a year. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't. Indeed, the transformation had been remarkable. Canada had not only joined the Commonwealth Economic Zone, but had become one of its most effective advocates, with Trudeau's government winning re-election on a platform of global leadership through partnership. The Canadian economy was growing faster than it had in a decade, with new technology partnerships bringing innovations to market at unprecedented speed. But the real victory wasn't economic, it was political. The Commonwealth Economic Zone had proven that middle powers could coordinate effectively enough to influence global affairs without requiring military dominance or economic coercion. It was soft power in its most sophisticated form. Prime Minister? His aide Margaret Chen had joined him on the observation deck. The Beijing call is ready. Sunak nodded and took the call, putting it on speaker as the lights of London began twinkling below them. The voice of the Chinese Premier was formal but noticeably more respectful than it had been a year earlier. Prime Minister Sunak, I wanted to personally congratulate you on the success of the Commonwealth Economic Zone. China is interested in exploring coordination opportunities. It was diplomatic language, but the subtext was clear. A year ago, China had viewed the Commonwealth as an irrelevant anachronism. Now it was seeking partnership with what had become a significant economic force. We're always interested in mutually beneficial cooperation, Sunak replied, his tone warm but not eager. I'll have my trade minister coordinate with your team. After the call ended, he turned to Chen. Record this in the official history when someone writes it. The most important lesson of the Commonwealth Economic Zone wasn't about trade or currency or development banks. It was about proving that nations can choose cooperation over competition without surrendering their sovereignty. Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. What about the personal aspect, Prime Minister? Your relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau? Sunak smiled, thinking about how their dynamic had evolved from confrontation to genuine partnership. Justin taught me something important that night in Ottawa. He showed me what ambition looks like when it's channeled toward building something rather than tearing something down. His mistake was thinking those two things were the same. A message notification chimed on his phone. Another text from Trudeau. Toronto wants to host the Commonwealth Economic Summit next year. Interest? Sunak typed back. Absolutely, but I want to propose something. Rotating host cities, rotating leadership, rotating agenda priorities. Make it clear this belongs to everyone. The response came quickly. Perfect. This is what partnership looks like. As the London Eye completed its rotation, Sunak reflected on the broader implications of what they had built. The Commonwealth Economic Zone wasn't just succeeding economically. It was providing a model for international cooperation that other regions were beginning to emulate. The African Union was exploring similar coordination mechanisms. Southeast Asian nations were discussing enhanced integration. Even within Europe, there were conversations about how the EU might adapt some Commonwealth innovations. The fundamental insight had been simple but powerful. In a multipolar world, influence belonged to networks that could coordinate effectively while respecting sovereignty. Military dominance and economic coercion were 20th century tools that created more problems than they solved. 21st century power required different capabilities: technological integration, financial innovation, and most importantly, the ability to make everyone better off through partnership. As his car pulled up to take him back to Downing Street, Sunak looked once more at the sprawling city below. A year ago, Britain had been managing decline, trying to find relevance in a world that seemed to have moved beyond traditional alliances. Tonight it was part of something that was reshaping global economics while respecting every member's independence. That, he thought, was what real leadership looked like in the modern world. Not dominance, but service. Not control, but coordination. Not empire, but partnership. And sometimes, it took a confrontation with an ambitious ally to reveal what was possible when ambition was directed toward building rather than destroying. The October wind cut through the streets of Ottawa like a blade, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Inside the grand stone walls of 24 Sussex Drive, the Prime Minister's official residence. The atmosphere was equally cold despite the crackling fireplace in the private dining room. 2 crystal wine glasses sat untouched on the mahogany table, their contents growing warm as the tension between their owners thickened. Rishi Sunak adjusted his navy suit jacket and studied the man across from him. Justin Trudeau had always been a performer, someone who understood the power of image, of careful staging. Tonight was no different. The Canadian Prime Minister had chosen this intimate setting deliberately, away from cameras and recording devices, where he could speak freely about what he really wanted. Trudeau's famous smile was absent as he leaned back in his leather chair, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. The silver serving dishes between them held an untouched dinner of Atlantic salmon and roasted vegetables, the kind of carefully curated Canadian cuisine meant to impress foreign dignitaries. But this was not about diplomacy anymore. Sunak had arrived in Ottawa 3 hours earlier, expecting routine discussions about trade protocols and Arctic shipping routes. Instead, he found himself facing what felt increasingly like an ambush. The preliminary meetings had been tense, with Trudeau's advisers presenting documents that seemed designed more to provoke than inform. Maps showing British influence in decline. Financial projections that painted the UK as a fading power. Trade statistics that highlighted Canada's growing independence from traditional Commonwealth ties. Now, in the quiet of this private dinner, Trudeau was ready to make his real intentions clear. The Canadian leader picked up a leather portfolio from the side table and placed it deliberately in the center of the white tablecloth. The portfolio was thick, bulging with documents that had clearly been prepared over months, not days. Sunak could see tabs sticking out, different colored papers, the careful organization of someone who had planned this moment meticulously. Rishi, Trudeau began, his voice carrying none of the warmth that usually characterized their public interactions. I want to be completely honest with you about where Canada stands. He opened the portfolio and pulled out the first document, sliding it across the polished wood towards Sunak. We're done being Britain's junior partner. The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Sunak picked up the document, his trained economist's eye immediately recognizing what he was looking at. Trade agreements, shipping contracts, resource extraction rights, all of them showing Canada's gradual pivot away from traditional Commonwealth partnerships and toward new arrangements with China, India, and the European Union. But it wasn't just the numbers that caught his attention, it was the timeline. These weren't recent developments. Some of these agreements dated back 2 years, carefully negotiated in secret while Trudeau had been publicly reaffirming Canada's commitment to Commonwealth cooperation. This has been in the works for quite some time, Sunak observed quietly, his voice betraying no emotion despite the calculation racing through his mind. Trudeau nodded without apology. Since the Queen died, actually, Charles doesn't command the same respect internationally. Brexit weakened Britain's global leverage. And frankly, Rishi, you're managing decline, not leading growth. The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had rehearsed the moment. Sunak set the document down carefully, his movements deliberate. He had been in enough boardroom confrontations to recognize a power play when he saw one. This wasn't just about trade deals or shipping routes. This was about humiliation, about forcing Britain to acknowledge its diminished status on the world stage. What exactly are you proposing, Justin? Trudeau smiled for the first time that evening, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. A new framework, one that recognizes Canada as the senior partner in our relationship. The phone in Sunak's hand buzzed again, and this time he answered it, putting the call on speaker. The voice that emerged was immediately recognizable. Narendra Modi, speaking in accented but perfect English. Rishi, the Delhi Declaration is ready for your review. Nigeria, South Africa and Bangladesh have confirmed their participation. Are we proceeding as discussed? Trudeau's face went pale. The Delhi Declaration wasn't something he had heard about in any intelligence briefing. This was happening in real time, and he was watching it unfold from the outside. Yes, Narendra, Sunak replied, his eyes never leaving Trudeau's face. I think it's time the world saw what the Commonwealth can become when it stops looking backward and starts building forward. The call ended, and Sunak set his phone down on the table next to Trudeau's carefully prepared documents. The contrast was stark, traditional paperwork versus real-time digital diplomacy. You want to know what you missed, Justin? Sunak asked, sitting back down but maintaining his newfound confidence. You assumed that breaking away from Britain meant breaking away from a dying institution. But what if the institution was already evolving? He pulled out a tablet from his briefcase, swiping through screens of data that showed economic projections, trade agreements, and technological partnerships that made Trudeau's Arctic shipping routes look like regional concerns rather than global game changers. While you were focused on Arctic passages, we were building digital highways. While you were counting oil reserves, we were creating a Commonwealth cryptocurrency backed by Indian technology, Nigerian resources, and South African minerals. While you were planning to abandon the club, we were rebuilding it into something that actually matters in the 21st century. The blood had drained from Trudeau's face as the implications became clear. That's impossible. We monitor your communication. You monitor the communications you expect to see, Sunak interrupted. But you didn't monitor the private diplomatic networks that have been operating for months. You didn't monitor the economic working groups that have been meeting in Mumbai, Lagos, and Cape Town. You didn't monitor the technology transfers that have been happening between Commonwealth universities. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge that Trudeau had never heard before. You thought you were playing three-dimensional chess while I was playing checkers, but I was playing a completely different game. Trudeau gathered himself, his political instincts kicking in despite his obvious shock. Economic blocs fail all the time. Look at the euro, look at ASEAN. You can't just manufacture relevance through agreements. You're absolutely right, Sunak agreed, which is why this isn't just about agreements, it's about capability. He swiped to another screen on his tablet, showing real-time data flows, cryptocurrency transactions, and technological partnerships that were already operational. The Commonwealth digital currency launched quietly 3 weeks ago. No fanfare, no press releases, just working code moving real value between member nations. Nigeria's oil purchases, India's technology exports, South Africa's mineral sales, all of it flowing through systems that don't depend on American dollars or Chinese yuan. Trudeau's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. You're talking about economic warfare. I'm talking about economic evolution, Sunak corrected. And your choice isn't what you thought it was 5 minutes ago. You're not choosing between following Britain or leading independently. You're choosing between joining the future or being left out of it entirely. The dining room had become a battleground of ideas, with the detritus of Trudeau's planned diplomatic coup scattered across the table like the remnants of a failed strategy. The Canadian Prime Minister looked down at his own documents, which suddenly seemed quaint and outdated compared to the real-time global coordination Sunak was demonstrating. This changes everything, Trudeau said quietly, more to himself than to Sunak. This changes everything, Sunak agreed, including your timeline, because the Commonwealth Economic Zone goes public tomorrow morning, and the question isn't whether Canada can lead it. The question is whether Canada wants to join it. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Trudeau's phone buzzing incessantly on the side table. He glanced at it and saw notifications from his economic advisors, his foreign ministry, his intelligence services. Word was already spreading through diplomatic channels that something significant was happening in Commonwealth economics and Canada was on the outside looking in. How long have you been planning this? Trudeau asked, his voice hoarse with the realization of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. Since the day I became Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sunak replied honestly. I realized then that Britain's future couldn't be built on nostalgia for empire. It had to be built on genuine partnership with nations that shared our values but not our history of exploitation. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Ottawa skyline. You know what the difference is between us, Justin? You see the Commonwealth as something to escape from. I see it as something to transform. Trudeau gathered his scattered documents, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone trying to maintain composure while his world shifted around him. My entire strategy was based on British weakness. Your entire strategy was based on misunderstanding what British strength could become, Sunak corrected, turning back to face him. You saw decline and assumed it was permanent. But decline can be the beginning of renewal if you're willing to admit your mistakes and build something better. Trudeau's phone buzzed again, and this time he answered it. The voice of his chief economic advisor was urgent, almost panicked. Prime Minister, we're seeing massive movements in global commodity markets. Something is happening with Commonwealth currencies that we don't understand. We need to convene an emergency session. Trudeau hung up without responding. He looked at Sunak with something approaching respect, though it was clearly costing him to acknowledge it. You played this perfectly, using my own timeline against me. I used your assumptions against you, Sunak replied. You assumed that if you could humiliate Britain publicly, the rest of the Commonwealth would follow your lead. But you never asked whether they actually wanted to abandon cooperation for competition. He returned to the table and began collecting his own materials. The Delhi Declaration will be announced in 6 hours. It creates a Commonwealth economic zone with its own currency, its own trade protocols, and its own development bank. India provides technology, Nigeria provides energy, South Africa provides resources, and Britain provides financial infrastructure. Trudeau absorbed this information like physical blows. Each detail represented months or years of planning that had happened completely outside his awareness. What about Australia, New Zealand? Already signed on, quietly. They were never as interested in abandoning the Commonwealth as you assumed. They were interested in making it more equitable. Sunak's phone buzzed with another notification. The Asian markets are opening in 2 hours. The announcement will happen during peak trading hours in Mumbai, Lagos, and Johannesburg. By the time North American markets open, the Commonwealth Economic Zone will be a reality. Trudeau slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him as he processed the full scope of what was happening. Where does this leave Canada? That depends entirely on you, Sunak replied, his voice not unkind. The Commonwealth Economic Zone can succeed with or without Canada, but it would be stronger with Canadian participation. Your energy resources, your technological capabilities, your geographic position, all of that would be valuable to the partnership. He paused, letting the words sink in. But it would have to be as a partner, not as a leader trying to prove independence by tearing down what others have built. Trudeau looked at the documents spread across the table, his own plans for Canadian dominance suddenly looking petty and provincial compared to the global vision Sunak had articulated. You're offering me everything I wanted, just not the way I wanted to get it. I'm offering you everything you need, Sunak corrected. Leadership, influence, economic growth, strategic relevance. The question is whether you're willing to accept it as part of something larger than Canadian nationalism. Outside the window, the lights of Ottawa continued to twinkle, but the world they illuminated had fundamentally changed in the space of a single dinner conversation. What had begun as Trudeau's attempt to force British submission had become Britain's invitation for Canadian partnership in reshaping global economics. The transformation of the evening's dynamic was complete, but Trudeau was not finished. Years of political survival had taught him that even the worst defeats could sometimes be turned into unexpected victories if you were willing to adapt quickly enough. He pushed back from the table and stood, pacing to the fireplace where orange flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. You've checkmated me, he admitted, his back to Sunak. But that doesn't mean I surrender. He turned around, and Sunak could see that the Canadian leader's political instincts had kicked into overdrive. If I agree to join this Commonwealth Economic Zone, what guarantees do I have that this isn't just a more sophisticated form of British domination? It was a fair question, and Sunak had been expecting it. You have the same guarantees that India, Nigeria, and South Africa demanded. Equal voting rights on all economic policies, rotating leadership of the development bank, geographic distribution of technological development projects, and most importantly, complete transparency on all financial flows. He pulled up another screen on his tablet, showing the governance structure they had been developing. This isn't the old Commonwealth with Britain at the center and everyone else on the periphery. This is a network of equals who happen to share certain legal and linguistic traditions. Trudeau studied the organizational charts, his mind working through the political implications. My base will crucify me for this. I've spent the last 6 months preparing them for a break with British influence. Then you'll have to explain that British influence isn't what's on offer, Sunak replied. What's on offer is Commonwealth influence, with Britain as one member among many. The room fell quiet except for the soft hiss of burning logs. Trudeau was clearly calculating, weighing the political costs of abandoning his independent strategy against the economic costs of being excluded from what was shaping up to be a significant global development. His phone buzzed again, this time with an encrypted message from his foreign minister. He read it quickly, his expression growing more serious. Beijing is asking for an emergency consultation about Canadian participation in Asian trade partnerships. They're nervous, Sunak observed. When the Commonwealth Economic Zone goes live, it becomes a fourth major economic bloc alongside the US, EU, and China. That changes the entire global balance of power. Trudeau set down his phone and looked directly at Sunak. If I do this, if Canada joins your Commonwealth Economic Zone, I need something in return. Name it. I need to be able to sell this to the Canadian people as a victory, not a surrender. That means Canada has to be seen as a founding member, not a late addition. And it means we need to host the first major summit. Sunak considered this for a moment. It was actually a reasonable request and one that served British interests as well as Canadian ones. Toronto or Vancouver? Toronto. And I want the announcement to come from both of us, jointly. Not from London with Canadian acquiescence. Agreed. They shook hands across the table, the gesture feeling more like a business partnership than a diplomatic protocol. In the span of a single evening, they had gone from adversaries to allies, with Trudeau's attempted power play transformed into the foundation for a genuine strategic partnership. "There's one more thing," Trudeau said as they prepared to leave the dining room. "What's that?" "I want to understand how you saw this coming, how you knew to prepare for something I didn't even know I was planning." Sunak smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had shown all evening. "Because I've been where you are, Justin. I know what it feels like to be in the shadow of something larger than yourself, whether that's British imperial history or American economic dominance. The difference is that I decided to build bridges instead of burning them." They walked together toward the front entrance of the residence, their footsteps echoing in the marble-floored hallway. The portraits of former prime ministers looked down at them, witnesses to another moment when Canadian politics had shifted direction. "One last question," Trudeau said as they reached the door. "Did you really have all of this planned from the beginning, or were you improvising?" "Both," Sunak admitted. "The economic framework was real. We've been building it for months. But I had no idea you were planning this dinner until 3 days ago. Sometimes the best strategy is being prepared for any outcome and letting your opponent choose which game you're going to play." As they stepped outside into the cold Ottawa night, both men understood that the world had changed in ways that would take time to fully appreciate. What had begun as a confrontation between two allies had become the foundation for a new kind of international cooperation. 3 weeks later, the boardroom on the 47th floor of First Canadian Place in Toronto hummed with quiet efficiency as delegates from 7 Commonwealth nations finalized the details that would reshape global economics. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of Lake Ontario, but none of the assembled officials were paying attention to the scenery. They were too focused on the documents spread across the polished conference table, legal frameworks and financial protocols that would govern the world's newest economic superpower. Sunak sat at one end of the table, reviewing the final draft of what would become known as the Toronto Protocols. Across from him, Trudeau handled questions from Nigerian Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed and South African Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago, with the confidence of someone who had found his footing in a new reality. The transformation in Trudeau's political positioning had been remarkable to watch. What could have been a humiliating reversal of his independent strategy had instead become his greatest foreign policy triumph. Canadian media was hailing his role in creating the Commonwealth Economic Zone as visionary leadership, proof that Canada could shape global affairs rather than simply react to them. "The currency stabilization mechanisms are in place," announced Dr. Raghuram Rajan, the Indian economic advisor who had designed much of the Commonwealth digital currency's architecture. "We're seeing adoption rates ahead of all projections." The numbers were indeed impressive. Within 2 weeks of the soft launch, the Commonwealth digital currency was handling over $12 billion in daily transactions across member nations. More importantly, it was demonstrating the kind of stability that attracted institutional investors who had grown wary of both American monetary policy and Chinese financial opacity. Trudeau looked around the table at faces representing economies that collectively served over 2 billion people. 3 months ago, I thought the future meant choosing between American and Chinese spheres of influence. I never imagined we could create our own." "That's exactly why it's working," replied Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, attending as a special advisor on global trade integration. "This partnership isn't defined by opposition to other powers, it's defined by positive goals that benefit everyone involved." Trudeau pulled out another set of documents, these even thicker than the first. Financial statements, resource assessments, military capability analyses, the paperwork of a country that had been quietly preparing to reshape the global order. "Look at the numbers, Rishi," Trudeau said, spreading the papers across the table like a poker player revealing a winning hand. "Canada's GDP growth has outpaced Britain's for 3 consecutive years. Our energy reserves are among the largest in the world. Our Arctic territories are becoming increasingly valuable as climate change opens new shipping routes." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "Meanwhile, Britain struggles to maintain relevance outside of Europe. Your military can barely patrol your own waters. Your economy depends on financial services that could relocate to any major city in the world." Each point was delivered like a surgical cut, designed to wound. Sunak remained motionless, but his mind was working furiously. He had read similar assessments in classified briefings back in London. The difference was that Trudeau was using these facts as weapons, not mere observations. "We're offering you a choice," Trudeau continued. "Join us as an equal partner in a new North American Commonwealth, or watch as we build the future without you. He pulled out a map of the Arctic, marked with shipping routes and resource extraction sites. These passages will handle 30% of global trade within a decade. We control access to them. China is very interested in partnerships that don't include British oversight. The threat was implicit but clear. Canada wasn't just offering independence from Britain, it was threatening to align with Britain's strategic competitors. Sunak picked up his water glass, buying himself a moment to process what he was hearing. Through the dining room window, he could see the lights of Ottawa stretching into the distance, the capital of a country that had spent over a century in Britain's shadow and was now preparing to step decisively into the light. "The Commonwealth dies with you, Rishi," Trudeau said quietly. "Australia and New Zealand are already exploring alternatives. India has its own agenda. South Africa is focused on regional partnerships. The old boys club is dissolving, and you can either acknowledge that reality gracefully or fight it and lose everything." Sunak set down his glass and finally looked directly at Trudeau. What he saw was not just ambition but genuine conviction. The Canadian leader believed every word he was saying. This wasn't political theatre. It was a carefully calculated attempt to force a new world order. "You've thought this through," Sunak observed. "Every angle?" "Every angle," Trudeau confirmed, "including the part where Britain becomes what it should have been decades ago, just another European country with delusions of grandeur." The dining room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sound of traffic outside. Sunak could feel the weight of history pressing down on the moment. Decisions made in rooms like this had shaped the world for centuries. Tonight it felt like another such moment was arriving. He reached into his own jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be recent messages. Trudeau watched with growing confidence, interpreting the gesture as a sign that Sunak was preparing to concede, perhaps calling London for instructions on how to manage this new reality. Instead, Sunak smiled. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it carried something Trudeau hadn't expected to see: amusement. "Justin," Sunak said, his voice carrying a note of something that sounded almost like sympathy, "you've made one critical miscalculation." He turned his phone screen toward Trudeau, showing a series of notifications that had been arriving throughout their dinner. Messages in Hindi, Swahili, Arabic, Portuguese. Confirmations from capitals across the developing world. "While you've been planning Canada's independence from the Commonwealth, I've been planning the Commonwealth's independence from the old model entirely." Trudeau's confident expression began to flicker. "What are you talking about?" Sunak stood slowly, his movement causing the candlelight to dance across the documents scattered on the table. "You assumed that if you broke away from Britain, you'd be breaking away from irrelevance. But what if I told you that the Commonwealth you're abandoning is not the one that's going to exist tomorrow?